Well, I decided that at the end of a second term, I would be in my mid 80s. And I frankly think it's time for the next generation to step up and make the decisions that shape the world that they're going to be living in. The reality is, we're doing a lot of things as the baby boom generation that are going to have a big impact over a long period of time. And we need some young people to step up and say, hey, no, we want to make these decisions in the way we want them to shape our lives. And that's not happening yet. And frankly, it's time for people in their 80s to move on, like me.
You've also been quite critical, though, of the populist demagogue message, to use your phrase, in the Republican Party. Is that part of it?
There's no question but that my party has two divisions, at least. And one is very populist, the Donald Trump super MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And I represent a much smaller wing. I call it the wise wing of the Republican Party. And I think that the Trump fever will ultimately break and the parties will realign, but that's not going to happen anytime soon.
And what would you say to those in the Republican Party who say, we need people like you, like now we need you to stay?
Well, I'm not going away. I'll be around for the next year and a half as a senator, and after that I will stay involved and try and have as much impact as I possibly can. But we got to get some young people to step forward and to shape our party and make decisions that will affect the future of our country. And that can't happen if a bunch of 80-year-olds are making the decisions on things like AI and how we're going to deal with China and Russia, climate change. I mean, you know, Donald Trump, who is the presumptive nominee, I believe, of our party for 2024's presidential contest, I mean, he says climate change is a hoax. Well, do young people believe that? And is that the posture they want our party to take? I hope not.
You mentioned China and Russia a moment ago. 11 years ago, when you were running for the presidency, you appeared on CNN and said, and I quote, "Russia is without question our number one geopolitical foe." The Obama campaign pounced on that comment, with President Obama saying that the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back. How do you reflect on that statement and that response today?
Well, as I said then, there's no question, but that at that time, for instance, that that Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular was the geopolitical adversary of the United States and of the West generally. Frankly, Putin was supporting all of the world's worst actors. He was opposing almost every action we took at the UN to try and rein in North Korea or Iran. And so he was, if you will, the geopolitical adversary. That doesn't mean we're in conflict or war with Russia, but Russia was our adversary. And I think he's demonstrated that more clearly in a kinetic way by his awful invasion of Ukraine and other actions he's taken over the ensuing years. Today, I think you have to look and say that Russia and China, perhaps collaborating, or China even on its own, represents a greater threat long-term to the prosperity and peace of the West and of the world at large.
In May last year, you wrote an essay in the New York Times in which you argued that the West should confront China and other Russian allied nations with an ultimatum. You're either with us or you're with Russia. You cannot be both. In your view, did the West go far enough to isolate Russia?
No, I don't think so. I do acknowledge that we made extraordinary strides to come together, provide the weaponry that Ukraine needed. We have a lot more to do with regards to China. On the Russia front, I think we've collaborated very effectively. I'm concerned that in my country, you're seeing some people say, okay, we've done enough, let's move on. In my opinion, that's very foolish, very short-sighted, because if Russia thinks they can get away with what they did in Ukraine, China's going to feel the same way about Taiwan. Other authoritarians are going to say, why don't we take the population and resources of our neighbor? That's just not something that I think that the liberal democracies of the world can countenance.
So what do you say to those then, including figures in your own party, who say it's too expensive for America to keep supporting Ukraine in the way that it has?
You know, there are a lot of excuses that populists have to do what they want to do, but the idea that it's too expensive is a little funny. We spend about $850 billion a year on defense. We're using about 5% of that to help Ukraine. My goodness, to defend freedom and to decimate the Russian military, a country with 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us, to be able to do that with 5% of your military budget strikes me as an extraordinarily wise investment and not by any means something we can't afford.
How would President Romney have handled President Putin?
Well, I think President Putin responds to strength and predictability, and I would have made it very clear from the very beginning that we would stand with Ukraine and that we would do everything in our power to align with our friends throughout the world. I mean, the great power of freedom and freedom-loving countries is that we link arms with one another, and that we work in solidarity. And I, by the way, I believe President Biden has done a nice job in making sure that people recognize that the NATO alliance and freedom-loving nations generally have come together. So my posture would have not been dramatically different than that you've seen from the current president. I think, benefit of hindsight, I would hope that I would have moved more quickly to get more advanced military support, S-16s and more longer-range missiles, cluster bombs, and so forth, to get that more quickly so that Ukraine had a better shot of actually defeating Russia as opposed to having it drag out as long as it is.
You sound quite favorable towards American foreign policy then. How would you factor Afghanistan into that?
One, President Trump was wrong to negotiate the departure from Afghanistan with the Taliban without involving the government of Afghanistan at that time, and then putting in place a timetable that was unrealistic. And then number two, President Biden followed through with that timetable and was terribly prepared to see the withdrawal of our troops and the troops of our friends and allies around the world. It was a awful experience, and we've shown we keep doing this. We make bad foreign policy decisions. We're generally forgiven because people believe, and I believe correctly, that we're trying to do our best, but we've made some big mistakes.
What advice would you give to European countries, therefore, still, of course, heavily reliant on US military support as we enter the presidential election year?
You know, I think the best thing European countries can do to be confident in ongoing US support for NATO and other investments is to show that European countries want to carry their own weight and are willing to carry their own weight and to make the investment they need to keep up with what we're doing. Well, some are and some aren't. About half of the NATO nations have reached the 2% of GDP goal, and some haven't. And if the advice I would give is, if you want to be sure that in the event that Donald Trump gets reelected and he's kind of wobbly on NATO, if you show that you made a commitment yourself, that makes it far more likely that he would stick with the NATO alliance. That, by the way, I believe without question has been largely responsible for preserving world peace over the past half a century.
Given what you've just said, would you be voting for President Biden if it was Donald Trump who had the Republican nomination?
Well, I'm not going to be supporting President Trump, former President Trump, under any circumstance. I happen to believe that character is destiny, and I believe that a number of his personality and character flaws are ones that would make it impossible for me to support him.
If the Republicans more broadly take back the White House, should the West be worried?
Yeah, the West should always be worried. Look, in the history of the world, authoritarianism has been the default setting. I mean, you go back thousands of years, it's one authoritarian regime after the other, and they all collapse one after the other. Freedom is hard to preserve. So any free nation has to recognize that we want to make sure that the largest and strongest military and economy of our group is doing well and is committed to the principles that we agree on. And so, yeah, there's reason for worry. At the same time, I happen to believe that freedom is an extraordinary elixir, and that nations that embrace freedom are more likely to be unified and more likely to lead the world from a technological and economic standpoint into the future.
Because it does feel rather like the world is being divided again into democracies and autocracies. And in that vein, if the US is the head of the latter, how healthy do you think American democracy is?
I do believe that our democracy remains extraordinarily strong, but I believe that we do need to not just confront Russia and Ukraine, but also say, all right, let's strike at some of the sources of the power that the authoritarians have, which largely comes from their economic might. They're not as powerful as we are collectively, but they need access to our markets, and they should only have free access to our markets if they're playing by the same rules the rest of us play by. And so far, we haven't come together as a group of democracies and said, okay, look, let's talk about what the rules are. Let's make sure that China understands to be sending their products into our markets, you've got to live by these rules. You can't engage in predatory pricing. You can't subsidize technologies as you have. You can't monopolize key raw materials that are necessary for the products of the future. These things you can't do and expect to have access to our markets.
In a meeting of the Foreign Relations Committee, you said, "I don't want to oversimplify our successful strategy relative to the former Soviet Union, but we outcompeted them militarily, economically, and they finally cried uncle." What strategy should America and the wider West adopt, in your view, towards Russia and, by extension, the next major geopolitical rival, China?
Yeah, I wish we had a strategy. I think if you look at China, they've laid out where they want to be in 2049, where they want to be along the way. They have a strategy which is not just military, but also geopolitical. They also have an economic strategy. They're going to go after key, fast-growing industries and establish dominance, raw material dominance, sourcing through their Belt and Road. I mean, it's a very complicated, complex, and comprehensive strategy. Do we in the West have the same? No. And so part one is we have to develop that kind of strategy and talk amongst ourselves and say, okay, how are we going to deal with the emergence of China? And my view is not to say, how do we get ready to fight them? Because no one wants to see a fight between the authoritarian nations and the free nations. But how can we get them to become diverted from a course of conflict and instead play by the same rules we're playing by? And by the way, if we play by the same rules, I'm happy to bet that we'll win. Because again, freedom is pretty powerful. But we got to get them to play by the rules. And I believe at this stage, the way to divert them from a path of conflict is to engage them in adopting and following the rules of commerce that the rest of us live by. That, if you will, it's commerce that fuels their expansion of their military might and their expansion into geopolitical entities. And so we got to get the commerce part right.
We didn't get the commerce strategy right with Russia, though, did we? So how do we get it right with China?
Well, being able to if you will, dissuade Russia from its massive financial resources is kind of a challenge when their resources are raw ingredients or are coal and oil. I mean, they've got those things. So that's a little harder for us to crimp that, although with the sanctions, we're making it a little more painful for Russia. But with regards to China, their resources come from manufactured goods that they sell into our markets. And they're able to make exceptional profit by doing so, by driving Western businesses out of business. So this is a place where we come together, and if we say we're going to exercise our economic might to say to the Chinese, we're not going to buy your products. We're not going to let you come into our markets unless you agree that you can't subsidize these key industries, that you can't monopolize certain raw materials. We have the capacity to make that kind of a strategy and to have an impact by virtue of doing so. To get Saudi Arabia to struggle with poverty, it would be almost impossible given their oil wealth. Same thing was true with Russia.
What do you think the current strategic assessment is of Britain here in Washington?
I think people recognize that Great Britain is the most reliable, long-term friend and ally that we have in the world. That we share not just a language, we share a culture, and frankly, the foundation of our country was built on the system of laws and constitutional order that we inherited and borrowed from Great Britain. So the ties continue to run extraordinarily deep, and I think we respect the leadership in Great Britain and have for a long time. I mean, and as you look at some of the world's great leaders, I mean, we think of Washington and Lincoln in that category, but we also think of Winston Churchill as been one of the greatest leaders in world history. So, yeah, there's a very close relationship and admiration and respect. And for Pete's sakes, how it is that we continue to care so much about the royalty is the strangest thing. But Americans find the royalty, your royal family, to be of great interest, which I scratch my head, but I engage in it too. They're very charming people, and there continues to be a very strong bond between our nations.
So where do you stand then on Prince Harry and Meghan?
Oh, I think Prince Harry and Meghan are fantastic, but I also think the same thing about Princess Kate and Prince William, and I think the world of the new king. I had a chance to meet him when we were both teenagers, so that's my claim to fame.
We've got to hear that story.
He came to the White House when Richard Nixon was president, and he came there and was with Tricia Nixon and others, and I was in the great receiving line and had to get trained in what you say to royalty. I've forgotten what it is, but I do follow that.
You're not running for a second term here at the Senate, but you said you still want to be active. What are you going to be doing when you leave this place?
Well, for the next year and a half, there are a few things I really want to concentrate on. I have to admit that I think they're hard to accomplish because I think they require presidential leadership. And I think President Biden and former President Trump, depending on who gets elected, they're both unwilling to really do what's necessary to confront them. One is the amount of debt we have. It's becoming a real problem. And neither one of those two is willing to take that on. Number two, climate change. We're not doing the things that would actually impact global climate. Yes, we're doing things here domestically, but the U.S. isn't the big source of CO2 emissions anymore. China is, and Brazil, and Indonesia, and India, and developing nations. And we're not doing what we need to, in my view, on climate change. And then finally, developing a comprehensive strategy to deal with authoritarians. We need to do more there. So these are things I'm going to be working on. But I recognize the lack of presidential leadership on these topics is going to make it very difficult for them to be resolved in the next year and a half. So I'll keep on working from the outside of the building.
You've been in politics a long time. How's it changed over the period you've been in and around it?
Yeah, I've been in public service of one kind or another for about 25 years. My real career was in the private sector, which is where I enjoyed most of my life. But yeah, public service has been important and a valuable part of my life experience. I think it's fair to say that there has been a decline in respect and comedy among the elected class, that the rise of populism and demagoguery has been a little alarming. It's hard for me to recognize some aspects of my own party. I mean, some of the foundational principles of my party. One, that character was critical. Why, we sort of thrown character to the side. If Donald Trump does it, it's all just fine. We as a party were also the party of strong national defense and pushing back against Russia. And what are we doing? We've got Trump and Putin acting like they're buddies, and Trump calling Kim Jong-un, sending him a love letter. I mean, it's hard to recognize. We believe in trade and believe that America can win if we have trade with other nations. We've become more inclined to slow down trade. So there are a number of things that my party has changed in, but I think what's most stark is not just the change in policy, but the change in respect that existed between people of different political parties. 25 years ago, if you asked Republicans, how many of you think Democrats are really bad people, evil bad people, it might have been 10 or 20%. Today it's 50 or 60%. And the same is true if we were to look at Democrats looking back at Republicans. That kind of division in our body politic gets reflected in the people that are elected.
Why has it happened?
I wish I could put my finger upon what it is that's caused the great division in our country and perhaps in others as well. It's not just here, because you see this populism move in other places. One, there's a quote by somebody, H.L. Mencken. He said, to every complex issue, every complex problem, there's an answer which is simple, clear, and wrong. And the populists grab those answers, put them out there, get a lot of support, but they happen to be doing things that won't work and that are wrong. With time, people will recognize that, and that'll get brushed aside. But right now, that's kind of the fires that are burning. We need to, everything would be great if we get rid of such and such a group, this group of immigrants, or if we do this or the other. And so part of it is just the natural inclination that politicians have to say what the people want to hear. But also I think that social media has been a big contributor. In this country, we used to all listen to 3 television networks, one or the other, at the end of the day. Now there are dozens, and very few people even listen to them. They get their news curated for them by an algorithm that shows them what they want to read, basically what they agree with. And so we don't even hear what the other side is thinking or why they're thinking it. And and of course, then there's the decline in some of our institutions, churches, unions, those things, charities. There's less interaction among people. All these things, I think, have contributed to the growing polarization of our society. And then, not least, is you have politicians seeing that, seizing on it, throwing gasoline in that flame.